You're watching Knowledge and Wisdom, where we explore the depths of history, theology, philosophy, archaeology, and beyond. If you're curious to uncover truth and insight across time, this is the place for you. Hey everyone, I just had an interview with an associate professor of biblical studies, Dr. Robert Cargill. He is a scholar of the Dead Sea Scrolls, archaeology, the Second Temple period, all kinds of stuff. And in this particular video, we talk about archaeology in relation to the book of Genesis. Not everything he says I necessarily agree with, but I'm always happy to talk to scholars, especially when they're authorities in particular areas. So I hope you enjoy this video. Here it is. So I am really excited to talk to you, Dr. Cargill. I understand you're going to be delivering a lecture on archaeology, specifically in the book of Genesis. So I have to ask you, maybe why did you choose the book of Genesis and maybe not, one of the later books in the Second Temple period?
Sure.
Why Genesis?
Yeah, Genesis and archaeology don't frequently go together, especially with scholars who, take a critical approach. And so this is more of a provocative title. What I'm going to be doing is looking at archaeological claims about Genesis, and then we're going to be looking at those claims and saying, what can we actually tell archaeologically about the stories that we have in the book of Genesis?
What are some of those common claims that you've observed in your research?
Sure. So, I mean, a lot of the claims that we have in the book of Genesis are obviously the claims about creation. So we have people who claim, the earth was created in 6 literal days, or the earth is, the young earth claims. Garden of Eden claims, maybe people claiming, oh, the Garden of Eden is here. It's a fixed place. Maybe it's over here. So I've done these documentaries for, God, has it been 20 years? My beard says it's been 20 years. It used to be very dark. And I've done these documentaries where they're looking for the Garden of Eden. Where could it have been? And where they look for Sodom and Gomorrah, right? There's always archaeological excavations. I think some of them are actually very responsible. Others are not, where they're actually looking. Was there a historical Sodom? Now, we can have a debate over whether it was destroyed by fire and brimstone from the heavens,
Mm-hmm.
but was there were there the cities of the plain? Where were these cities? So we can have these debates over, was the earth flooded? Was the mountain, the highest peaks on the earth, were they flooded? So they have these claims that have been made. Have they found Noah's Ark? So that's what we're going to be looking at. What are the claims? What do most credible scholars say? And then, what archaeological evidence do we have that might inform the origins of some of the stories we have in the Bible?
I was talking to a Catholic biblical scholar, and he mentioned that he was, I think, at one of the SBL talks or something, and there was somebody giving a talk about how, in their own archaeological research, they discovered that Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed by some kind of hot, fire from heaven or something like that. Can you talk about that? Is there any truth to
Sure.
that?
Yeah, I've done actually 2 separate documentaries on this. They call it a hot blast or an asteroid blast. Basically, there's some asteroid coming in from the sky, and as it's breaking up, it creates this it's not a sonic blast, it's this heat blast that makes a concussive that just sends everything down and basically destroys the city. And that event could have been interpreted, obviously, by folks long ago, as God destroying the city with what looks like fire and brimstone, right? With stones and fire and coming down. And so, I mean, it's something that passes for plausible. We see these things it's always the Russians, right? They always have these cameras in their cars, and we know that stuff falls out of the sky. We know that, it can start fires. And so it's a pot. But then the documentary went in and said, okay, how do we know that this city is Sodom?
Mm-hmm.
How come it would destroy this but leave this? So we looked at that, but It's one of the theories that has basically been posited and then dismissed.
Yeah, that is a good question. How do we know it's Sodom? Because
Yeah.
it's not like you're gonna find a sign that says this is Sodom.
Right, right.
So,
Although you have them, you have um and we have Lot's wife. There's a very famous stone structure that in southern Israel, on when you're driving down along the western shore of the Dead Sea, that's
uh-huh,
called Lot's wife. It's just
uh-huh.
this big stone structure. So you have these types of things.
Yeah, but it'd be, I guess, it's not completely possible to determine conclusively if
Right.
this actually is the biblical
Right.
city of Sodom, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think there are some um, searches, there are some excavations, some expeditions right now that are better than others.
Mm,
That you actually, I happen to be of the camp that says Sodom probably was is a historical site, and that it probably was up in the northern end of the Dead Sea, probably on the eastern shore,
mhm.
and that makes a whole lot more sense than a city on the southern end of the Dead Sea. Um, you now, which of these remains, which of these cities, and can you identify it, and can you prove that it was destroyed as the Bible says? No,
Mhm.
but it doesn't mean that there wasn't a historical place somewhere in the ancient memory that lended its name to this tradition.
So, I mean, what can archaeology really tell us about the Bible, either confirming or denying? I mean, what can it really tell us?
This is the first lecture that I do with my students every year. So I teach a course on my book, The Cities That Built the Bible, every year at the University of Iowa, and it's one of the promises we make on my Bible and Archaeology channel on the website on YouTube. And it's this: it's that anyone who claims that the Bible is inerrant, infallible, and that any archaeology that disagrees with the Bible must be wrong, I think that's in error on one side. I also think that anybody who claims that the Bible needs to be just tossed out, that it's all myth, that it's all, and that's an error on the other side.
Mhm.
I think that what you have with the Bible are early attempts at writing history. I mean, we can call it historiography, but it were early attempts at writing who are we? What are our stories? What are our traditions? What do we know happened? And these often incorporated earlier legends, earlier traditions, and they were incorporated. Some of them were adapted. Some of them were adapted to tell not about those gods, the Babylonian gods or the Egyptian gods, but what do we want to say about our God and our morals and who we are as a people? And what happened to us early on? And that's going to take, sometimes it's going to look like Genesis 1, and sometimes it's going to look like Genesis 2. And they're taking what we do know is the creation stories are going to go up at the front. Then we're going to tell this flood story. Then we're going to, and they're relaying out these stories. And this is who we are. These are our stories. And as my old friend Vasilius Seferis, one of my early mentors in Israel in the archaeological world, he was Greek Orthodox, and I said, so how do you justify all this stuff? How do you prove this? And he goes, it's not for proving. This is our story. This is who we are. We believe this, and I'm Greek. This is what we believe. And I said, that's actually the most honest explanation I've ever heard. He was an archaeologist. He gave his life to the science. He gave his life to, and he didn't care so much whether it proved or disproved the biblical claim. This is the science, and this is my religious tradition, and I believe this, and this is part of my culture and my tradition, and this is what I do. And whether or not he could reconcile it, he didn't care. And I like that approach. And me coming out of a conservative religious background and then moving into the sciences, um, I like to know the origins of where these stories came from and why they did what they did with the stories. I love to study that. And I always make a promise to my students: I will never tell you what to believe. What I want to show you is if we have a piece of archaeological evidence that corroborates a claim made by the Bible, I want you to see that. And if we have a piece of archaeological evidence that challenges or maybe contradicts a claim made, I want you to see that too. I want you to see the evidence and what you choose to do with that. How you process it, that's up to you to decide. But my job as an honest broker of the evidence is to show you what we know and to be honest about what we don't know.
You mentioned there the origins of some of these stories. Of course,
Yeah,
I think we know the Epic of Gilgamesh for
sure.
the flood and things like that.
Mhm.
What are some other sources of the some of these stories?
Sure. Yeah, we have Egyptian mythological creation stories, right, where you have the one of the gods becomes the heaven, she's holding up the sky and then the earth. You have, he see it in his theogony. He has this story of Gaia and Uranus, right? The heaven and the earth, right? And how they were once together, but then there's this very dicey story where they get cut. I
Mm,
won't say where they get cut, but they get cut and they get separated, right? And you have this in the Mesopotamian story where Tiamat, right?
hmm
Tiamat gets cut in half. She's getting ready to devour, and they cut Tiamat in half, and one half becomes the dome of the heavens, and the bottom half becomes the earth. And it's interesting that while the Hebrew creation story doesn't necessarily, it has the heavens as a dome, that part is preserved, right? Because it specifically talks about a dome. And you have the earth. What it does preserve is the part of the separation. This is throughout the Bible that God separates the light from the darkness. He separates the day from the night. He separates the heaven from the earth, the waters above from the waters below. He separates that the creative process is this separation, almost like he's setting the tone from, I want to call my people out. I want them to be separate from the earth. I want you to act differently. I want you to behave differently. I want you to believe differently. So you get this separation that we see in all of these different creation stories, but it's not only separating the heavens and the earth and creating a place to live, but I want you to be a called out people. You see this in the origins of the church. You see this in it's a theme that carries through. I want you to be different. And yet, through you, I want you to help the people around you. I want you to be a blessing to those people around you. And it's one of the themes that I think carries all the way through the Bible.
I had a Egyptologist professor once told me that there was this Egyptian story that effectively parallels the story of Joseph. I've never been able to find that. I think she believed that it predated the biblical account. Do you know anything about that?
You have a lot of attempts to try to place the Joseph novella. I always say the Joseph story is trying to explain how the Israelites got into Egypt, and the Moses story is trying to explain how they got out.
Hmm
Because what the archaeology tells us is the people who became ancient Israel, the Israelites, were Canaanites. They were Canaanites. Now, did they get there because of Abram coming over from Mesopotamia? How did that come about?
hmm
But all the archaeology tells us that the people who, and we learned this from the Merneptah inscription, right?
hmm
Uh, these people were listed among these Canaanite groups that Merneptah claims to have, wiped out. But they're listed there among these early Canaanite groups, and as they tribed up, as they start to distinguish themselves from these other Canaanite groups, they want a foundation story. There
hmm
are a lot of runaway slaves that come out of Egypt. There are a lot of people immigrating in from the east. There are also people coming in from the west. We hear about the sea peoples coming in from the sea. And so they take all of these stories and they start crafting them together. Um, the story of the emancipation from Egypt, maybe that has some parallel with the story of emancipation from Babylon. This is what biblical scholars, work with. But what they are also doing is they know that they can't just ignore the archaeology, the history, the physical history that's around them. And so they incorporate legends and tales. They look, oh, this city of Jericho, it was destroyed. Did, did we destroy that? Let's incorporate that story. And they built this narrative, And we know that Judah, we know that the southern kingdom was close, was allies with Egypt. They had a lot of similarities with Egyptian culture. So it wouldn't surprise me if you have a lot of Egyptian stories that were close, that were incorporated. Now, to what extent Joseph? I mean, no, there's been attempts to try to tie Joseph to the Hyksos that have been
Hmm.
basically dismissed, but you, it would never. And we need to avoid parallelomania, trying to tie everything to something that exists. But it wouldn't surprise me if there are parallels that were drawn upon to try to craft this Joseph story, especially since the Joseph story has these bits and pieces in between them. But
Hmm.
the Joseph story is trying to attempt to give us a story of how these Canaanite Israelites, right, got to Egypt, so that then the Moses story can bring them out.
But there's nothing explicit in Egyptian
I,
manuscripts that would
I
confirm.
I think it's too late of a story. The narrative is
Mhm.
just too late of a story. Um, you also have some problems with it, right? He's marrying the daughter of an Egyptian priest, which later on becomes problematic. So you get the story of Joseph and Asenath. You get these, I always call them their plot holes, and so you have to get this fan fiction later on, like with the Star Wars movies, right? You got to, how can you blow up the Death Star from the outside with one shot? Oh, no, no, no. Rogue One says that they designed it that way. It was on purpose, right? So Joseph and Asenath, well, oh no, no, she converted. And that's usually the answer, right? Oh no, no, how can you have a Persian king be the Messiah in Isaiah 45? No, he converted. And so you get these stories later on that, the Persian king converted, so it's okay. That's a lot of this is what's going on. You have these early stories that early on weren't a problem, but later on, when they start looking at them and they take these texts that were never really meant to be reconciled, and they're trying to reconcile them historically, theologically, what do we do now? The rabbis were happy to make this oral tradition. They make these legends, and you just learn the oral Torah and you have the answer. But some people weren't comfortable with that. They wanted it in writing. Well, you can't change the Bible, so they wrote Joseph and Asenath, or they wrote Jubilees, or they wrote Enoch, and that gave them another way to solve these problems.
Does archaeology tell us anything about the origins of the name of God in the book of Genesis, either Yahweh or El Elyon? Were these, pagan deities that were appropriated by the Jewish people, or did they originate with the Jewish people?
I think you have, and this is Mark Smith in his work early on. Thomas Romer has done some recent work with this in his work. Uh, it appears clear from the evidence that we have that the what becomes the Hebrew deity was taken from a southern Canaanite deity, Yahoo, something like that. Early on, it appears that this deity was associated with Asherah, because we have this inscription. I think it's from Quintilia Ajrud or Kirbet El Kom, somewhere down there, that talks about, may you be blessed by Yahweh and his Asherah. So
Mhm.
you have somebody who's blessing somebody by these two deities. We know that you have the Yahoo tradition down in Egypt, all the way down there. You have this in the theophoric names. But if you read Mark Smith's work, it'll talk about how the Baal and the El traditions basically get conflated, get incorporated into the Yahweh tradition. If you look at some of the early Psalms, if you
Mhm.
look at some of Isaiah's writings, some of it's preserved so that when it talks about El, well, no, El is just a generic word for God. So, yeah, I know it's praising El, but that's just another way to say God. The El Elyon stuff I've worked with specifically in my work on Melchizedek.
Mm.
You do have inscriptions up from up north, right? Up in Phoenician, El and Elyon. Sometimes there's a vav, and there's a conjunction in there, so it's either two different deities that get conflated into one, but it's El Elyon, right? El and Elyon, who were Canaanite deities. There were known deities, and they come together, and you have these blessings. And the way that you deal with that is this deity that was Elyon becomes the most high God, probably had something to do with the high God. And then of course El was like, I always call him the deity emeritus, right? He sets everything up, and then he kind of becomes the chairman of the board and hands everything off to Baal, who's the CEO. He runs everything, and he's an emeritus, right? He's still the big guy, but he's not running things day to day. And El and Elyon become a way of saying God and El from the Ayin, right? From the loftiness, and it becomes God Most High, and that becomes another um, euphemism, another a synonym for God. So in Genesis 14, may you be blessed by El Elyon. This, instead of being may you be blessed by this Canaanite deity, it
Mhm.
becomes may you be blessed by God Most High. And then a little later on, you see there's a gloss, may you be blessed by the Lord, may you be blessed
Mm.
by Yahweh El Elyon. They actually added it in there, which we don't have in the Septuagint. So we can tell it's a gloss
Mm.
because it's not in the Greek translation of it. They added it in there to make clear, by the way, El Elyon is our God, right? It's not some pagan deity that this king of Shalem was worshiping.
I'm glad you brought up Melchizedek because that was going to be my next
Yeah,
question, but I thought of one in between. So let me ask you one more before we
sure,
get
sure.
to that. So, do we have any references to Yahweh in any of the Ugaritic texts, like the Bell cycle or something like that?
Boy, that's a good
To my
question.
recollection, I don't think I
I don't
saw any.
believe so. I've never seen one.
Hmm.
Ugaritic is mostly, if I remember correctly, Baal,
Hmm.
Anat,
Hmm.
Asherah,
Hmm.
El,
Yeah.
Mot, Yam.
Right.
There's a temple of Dagon, or at least last time I
Hmm.
checked, they're still calling it the Temple of Dagon. Um, but I don't believe there's a reference to Yahoo, or Yahweh up in
And
Ugarit.
that's what's wild to me, right? You would think that it would be there if this is a Canaanite deity, so it may have originated from some other group.
Yahweh appears to be, and again, I'll have to go back and read Thomas Romer and Mark
Mhm.
Smith's work,
Right.
a southern deity. So it's a
Southern, right.
southern Canaanite deity.
Okay,
So I don't know if we'd expect to find him in the north, but we
gotcha.
know that it was a southern deity.
That makes
We
sense.
like we find him down in the Sinai.
Mhm.
That's where we see him, and that's where he gets adopted.
I saw in your CV you did an article, I believe, or a book, how scribes invented the biblical priest king
Yeah,
Melchizedek, king of Sodom. So this was one of the questions I wanted to ask you
yeah.
about this figure Melchizedek that we find in the book of Genesis. Is there any archaeological evidence for him? And then number two, I got to hear about the concept of them inventing this figure.
Yeah, so my argument is essential, and there's a new article that's just come out that's arguing that it is an invented story, but it's from the Persian period, that it's a
Okay.
Persian invention that ties it to Ramat Rahel. This is Oded Lipschitz, and I think one of his students. And Oded's a longtime colleague, a friend of mine. But he disagrees with this theory. And look, Melchizedek has been a problem in the text for a long time. But my argument is that you've got the first half of the story, which appears to be some iteration of a historical chronicle, right? These kings from the north came in and pillaged Canaan and took some stuff and started. And then you get, Abraham the Hebrew, which is what it calls him. So they're inserting this hero narrative, and he's going to go up and he's going to rescue Lot. He's going to rescue his relative, and he's going to basically take back the stuff that was taken from Sodom. Because remember, one of the kings was Sodom, Gomorrah, in these five cities. According to the Hebrew Bible that we have, the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah died. They died. Then you have in when Abraham takes them back and comes back to return the stuff, the king of Sodom comes out. Now, one argument is that these are two separate stories. They're unrelated. They got plugged together. So it's the same king of Sodom. What I argue is that this was a known thing. Whether they're two different stories or not, they would have known that the king of Sodom died when they plugged the two stories together. So this has to be someone else. And
Mhm.
so the way that the story makes the most sense is that the king who comes out was Melchizedek. And so Melchizedek, the king of Sodom, and when you read it that way, the Melchizedek, the king of Sodom, comes out and he says, hey, don't give me any of the stuff that you recovered. Just give me my people, which is a way of saying, look, you did all this hard work. You went up and it's a righteous thing to do, right? You keep all the booty. You keep all the goods. Give me the people. And Abram, of course, not one to be outdone, says, no. He does this when he tries to negotiate for the cave to bury his wife. He never wants to look like a pirate. He never wants to look like, a warlord. So he says, no. Nobody's going to say they made Abraham rich. You take all the stuff and the people and just let me keep the stuff that my guys ate, my troops ate. Right. Now, the problem is that later on, you're going to have this tradition that Sodom is a horrible, terrible, horrible, no good, very bad place, right? And God's going to destroy it. And so they want to, and remember, Abram's got this other tradition where he's negotiating down to try to spare the city of Sodom. So you've got these two traditions where Abraham is affiliated with Sodom. And scribes later on are like, we can't have Abram being so closely tied to the city of Sodom. We certainly can't have the king of Sodom come out and bless him by God, right? We can't have that, especially if it's a pagan god. So what I argue is they changed the name Sodom, the sibilant, Samic, Dalet Mem, to Shalem. They changed a letter. And usually you've got the sibilant, and then you've got a letter, and then so they changed it to Shalem, which solves the problem. Now Melchizedek's not the king of Sodom anymore. He's the king of Shalem. It's a different character, which explains why Melchizedek appears to just out of the ether. King of Sodom and king of Shalem are now two different people. And, pardon me, this creates a different problem, and that is all the references to Shalem that we have are up in the north. In the Hebrew Bible, Shalem is a city outside of Shechem. And so that's great. You've distanced Abraham from Shalem, but now you've made him close to basically what would become the Samaritan capital. We can't have that. So they've incorporated this tradition that Shalem is just a short nickname for Jerusalem, when all of the archaeological evidence that we have has this Urushalemu from the execration text, from the Amarna tablets. And so they had to then do this other tradition of saying that Shalem is actually a tradition of Jerusalem. And then this becomes the only reference in the Pentateuch of Jerusalem, even though it doesn't say that. And if you look at the later texts, Genesis Apocryphon, you look at Josephus, you look at all the later texts, they just replace Shalem with Jerusalem. So there's this multi-pronged attempt to first remove Abram from Sodom and then take Shalem and make it into Jerusalem. That's the essence of the book.
There's so much I'd like to ask you, but I know we're running out of time. So let me ask you one quick question here. You mentioned there the manuscript tradition, something I'm incredibly interested in. I don't want to go too far afield from our topic here, but when we talk about the manuscript tradition for the book of Genesis in archaeology, just to my knowledge, we only have, fragmentary portions in the Dead Sea Scrolls, 3rd century BC, to my recollection. That appears to be the earliest. Is that correct?
So when we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, we suddenly had autographs of the Hebrew Bible that were 1,000 years older than the previously oldest thing that we had.
Right.
So the earliest Dead Sea Scrolls date to the maybe late 3rd, but 2nd century BC.
So, I mean, that's pretty far removed from the patriarchal period, right?
Yes,
So
yes.
is there really any indication that there was some kind of strong method of preservation in that period, or does it look like this is kind of, questionable and on shaky ground?
No, unfortunately. And we'll talk about this in the New Insights lecture. We don't have any archaeological evidence for any of the patriarchs. We don't have any archaeological evidence for these claims made in Genesis. We have archaeological evidence for the context, but we don't have archaeological evidence for the claims. for Noah and Adam and Eve and Abraham and these guys. What we can show is archaeological evidence for a lot of the parallels to the stories that we have. And we can show evidence, manuscript evidence, of the changes that were made to some of these stories over time. And again, I like to point to why the stories were changed and preserved the way they were, especially when you compare them to the original, not the originals, but the parallels that we do have evidence for. Why did the Israelites make the claim that humans were made in God's image? Why was this such a big deal? When the Babylonian texts were like, nah, they make too much noise. We need humans to come and clean things up. They were made for a different purpose. But for some reason in the Jewish tradition, humans were made in the image of God. Why is that? I like to look at that kind of stuff, and not whether or not we can prove that this stuff is true.
Hmm.
If it
Really
was
fast.
historical.
I would be amiss if I didn't ask about
Sure.
authorship, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Authorship and dating. There might be some parts of Genesis that appear to be ancient, such as the descriptions of the covenants and sacrifices and things like that. Um, some might argue that puts it into an early period. What do we know about dating internally and archaeologically, and also authorship?
I think based on this would be linguistic evidence. Looking at
Hmm.
the Hebrew, I think you can date the text back to the 10th century. Looking at the Song of the Sea, looking at some of these early
Right.
Psalms. But again, this is looking at early biblical Hebrew, archaic biblical Hebrew,
Hmm.
archaic Hebrew. Um, I think you'd have difficulty, and there's a group out there making some outrageous claims so that they can place the language earlier than this. I think scholarship is going to say it's hard to place anything earlier than the 10th century, anything in Hebrew at least.
Hmm.
And is the Gezer calendar probably something dating to the 10th century? Is that Hebrew? And if it is, then that corresponds to that. This is the 10th century. Uh, Anything earlier than that, um, I think you'd be hard pressed to say that we have any evidence for.
Hmm.
And so, this is David, Solomon. And so everything before that is going to come either, you could argue, from memory, or you can say was crafted and redacted by later scribes.
Yeah, I've tried to see if there's any evidence for this idea of preservation of the text by memory, and I really haven't found a whole lot there.
There are a lot of studies that will argue that oral tradition is actually, uh, it's hard to wrap your head around, but is actually better at preserving a lot of these stories than written tradition, because we
Hmm.
see that the written tradition gets edited. You put two manuscripts side by side and you'll see
Hmm.
the changes that they made. Whereas a lot of these oral traditions, once they get put to song, if you've ever been in a church and you've sung a song that you've sung a million times, and you go visit another church and they sing that song differently, you're like, hey, no, time out. That's not how we sing this song, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Once something's put to music, you don't change the lyrics to this stuff. There's this way that this song goes, and that's not how we sing this song. So a lot of this oral tradition, a lot of researchers will argue, is actually pretty fixed. Now, obviously, it's not, right, because you can just change it. But a lot of this oral tradition, I think there was some fixation to it, as
Hmm.
opposed to the written stuff, which we assume is in stone, which it actually isn't.
Right.
So it's a worthwhile debate to have.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, I know we're out of time. There's so many other questions I'd love to ask you, but this was such an honor. Thank you so much. I
Michael,
really
it's
appreciate this. And
good
I'm
to
going to, of course, put a link to the lecture that you'll be delivering. Looking forward to seeing what you do there.
good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for watching. Make sure to subscribe. And for a deeper dive, check out my courses at rtcourses.com and my Patreon channel at patreon.com/Reason in Theology.